Here, this is just some quick tips and tricks for assembling your RSLK. So here I've got a somewhat assembled RSLK. You'll notice there's several steps to the assembly process. You'll get a kit of parts, and basically the first suggestion I would have is just lay out all those parts on a clean surface and have all your baggies of little things and components all out so you can see what's available. Then you basically want to follow the assembly guide as written and go step by step. And what's cool is if you're working in teams, you can actually parse out the different pieces of the assembly process, and that'll help it go a lot faster as well. So one major piece of the assembly will be your motor board, which is included here. So the major tasks of the motor board, one is you need to do what they call cut the traces. There's some PCB traces. If you look closely here, there is two areas up here at the top of the board, and then there's also one further down over here. And basically the idea here is, if you look at that closely, there's these very tiny lines connecting these square pads, and basically what you want to do is just take a knife or like a very thin sharp object, and you just want to make a nice cut or kind of scratch through that thin line, and that will disconnect those two pads. And that's basically what we're doing there when we're saying cut the trace. You just want to cut that electrical connection between the two pads, and that's all you have to do there. So that's one step. Then the next step is they recommend you like solder a bunch of these headers on, so that you'll be able to connect it to the launch pad later. So you'll be doing that. You'll be basically taking these breaking these headers together. The headers will come in like long strips, kind of like this. So what you can do with this, there's two ways to kind of shape these. You can either take a tool, if you have wire cutters, or if you have like just scissors or something. What you can do is just figure out how many of these you need, and then you can just kind of get right in their index. There's a little groove in between those, and then just put your scissors or whatever right there and cut it. The other way is you can actually break these by hand, these breakaway pins. So again, just count out what you need, and then you can kind of put your fingernail in between those things, and then put your one hand on one side, the other hand on the other side, and just very gently you can break those pins and fit them to size. So that's the two ways to do that. So basically you'll gather your different pins, you'll solder those on. That's what one group inside the team can do. Then we have these encoder things. So what you want to do is attach those to the motor, and that's explained in the assembly guide. So basically you will line those up flush to the motor, and then there's two tabs on the motor that you will then solder that down to. And then also there are some headers down here, which is what's plugging into the motor board in the later steps. So you'll solder those right angle headers on and make sure those are going the right way as well. So that's another task. Then another task is prepping our push button wiring. So in the box you get a bunch of wires. You can separate them out if you need to, but I would recommend, just like in the assembly guide, kind of clustering them together so they'll come together, and then you just kind of separate them out for however many you need. So what you'll do is, actually there's a couple methods for this attachment here. One is, of course, you can just solder this directly on. So how do we do this? So basically you have a full wire which has some kind of, male connector, and then there's female connector wires as well. So like I said, just kind of keep them in groups, and you'll need I think 6 of these females, 6 of the males. And then what you'll do is you'll take a tool, kind of like a wire cutter, like this tool, and then you can go ahead and snip off the ends. And those ends, keep track of those. You might want to use those later in a step with the line following sensor. But basically you'll cut off the ends for a bunch of these. Then you can go ahead and use these strippers, they're called. So go ahead and kind of grab the end of the wire with the right size hole at the end, and then what you're going to do is just pull up, and that will strip off the outer housing of the wire and expose the copper side of it. So you'll have basically these wires exposed. And then there's two methods, like I said. You can either directly solder that copper wire ending to the push button, or there's also these different connectors, spade connectors, you can actually crimp onto there. And then once you crimp those on, you'll be able to just slide that directly into the push buttons, which are like these little connectors here. So you just slide on that spade connector, and that'll look pretty good. These is an example of the spade connector here. So this is a wire with the spade connector. So you'll take your crimper tool, or you can use like pliers, or you can use your wire cutters if it's got a flat edge on it. And basically what you want to do with this is you'll have your exposed wire, and what you can do is fold in. So if you have a little bit extra kind of wire hanging out, you can fold that over on itself, and then you have two spots here. There's the main kind of crimping connection for the copper side, and there's another crimping section here for the kind of the outer wire housing. So you're going to crimp those down using either your pliers or your tool, and then that'll be securely on. Just double check that's on securely, because that's making a good connection. And then what you'll do is then plug it into your push button like that. So that's pretty nice and easy. Cool. So the push buttons you'll prep. Then you'll actually want to place stuff on the chassis itself. So this roomy chassis here, on the top side, of course, you'll have your motor board. There's the batteries. So underneath there's the battery housing with the battery tabs. So when you put in your 6 AA batteries, those will stick out. So they'll come out of the plastic chassis, and then when you put your motor board on, they'll have exposed endings here, which you'll need to solder down. So there's 4 of those. And then once you solder those down, you'll screw down the motor board as well. So find a spot, usually the corners, where you can screw down this motor board, and then that will be attached. And then you'll want to attach your push buttons as well. So your 6 push buttons. There's a couple ways you can do them. So one way is, as shown on the guide, you just kind of put your screw through, and then there's a support nut that you can then tighten down from the bottom side. Or you may find it easier if you actually put the screw coming up from the bottom, and then you can put the nut on top, and then you can screw it like that. So that might be a little bit easier, depending on, because there is a lip on this chassis, which will make it a little bit harder to access the bottom. So you'll basically set up your 6 push buttons like this. And that'll be your push buttons. On the bottom side, you'll also have a place for your line following sensor. So your line following sensor is over here. Basically, this will help you detect ground stuff. So another task you'll need to do is solder on these right angle headers, and then also solder on the solder bridge here for the 3.3 volt bypass. So that's what I'm saying, when you did the clipping for your wires, make sure you have a little bit of a segment that you can use for that 3.3 bypass. Just cut this down, strip it, and then you can use that to solder into that bypass pin. So that's another step. Then you'll mount that with some standoffs that are included in the kit. Then you'll also want to attach your launch pad standoffs. So that's what these guys are doing. Your launch pad will sit on top of the rover. And then you'll attach your wheels as well, and then plug those, once you've soldered, of course, the encoders on, your motors are prepared. Once you have your motor board attached, then you're ready to go and put on the motors like that. And then the last step will be the wiring. So you'll wire, in the assembly guide they'll show you which wiring you'll need to do. So there's a bunch of wires that'll connect up to the bottom of the launch pad on a lot of the female headers, and that will give you a lot cleaner look. I also forgot to mention there's another, on the launch pad itself, there's the 19 by 2 header. So in the box it ships with a 2 by 20. You'll need to just cut that down by 1 pair of pins. So again, same like thing on the single breakaways. Just go ahead and line up, get a tool like a wire cutter or a scissors, and just line up that 1 pin row, and then cut that off. And then you'll have the 19 by 2 header here. And then just go ahead and down the line, someone can help solder all these points here. So that's how you prep the launch pad. And then of course once the launch pad's prepped, then that's when we do the wiring from the mostly female side on the underside of the launch pad, and then also there'll be some wiring on this header that we soldered on here. So they'll give you a nice clean look. The launch pad will sit on top, and then you'll be basically ready to go from there. So those are the major tips and tricks. Another big thing is for your dealing with your nuts and screws and things like that. One handy trick you can do, of course, if you can get an extra pair of hands, is nice. One thing is, if you wanted to kind of preset the nut before you go into the screw, you can do it like this where it's barely threaded on another screw, and then you can go ahead and come up onto the screw that you want to attach and then do it that way. So that's one way that you can potentially work with these kind of very tiny parts, because they do get crazy. And make sure you keep track of your parts, make sure you're working on a clean surface and you're not dropping them all over the floor, because it can be really hard to find these once they get lost. So that's another big tip as well. Last, also on the tires here, these can be tricky, so just make sure you stretch out your tires and get those fully seated on your wheels. And that should pretty much do it. So yeah, once you put on your launch pad, just be gentle. You'll have a lot of wiring when everything is done. And basically what you want to do is come over the top with the launch pad. You'll probably have to like maneuver the wiring a little bit. So just be careful when you're doing that. And then that basically will sit on the standoffs here, and then there's some additional tie-on knots that you can do here. On these standoffs too, just be careful, don't over tighten these as well. They might have a little bit of play or a little bit of looseness from the screw to the standoff here, so just be careful. That's totally fine. You can tighten everything down a little bit tighter once everything's kind of set up, but in the beginning, if it's all a little bit loose, that's totally okay. So that's pretty much how you do the assembly for the RSLK. Good luck and have fun.